Emily from British Girl Bakes, and I'm going to show you how to make this Ralph Breaks the Internet cake.
Shouldn't it be Ralph Wrecks the Internet?
This video is a collaboration with Delicious Sparkly Cakes. She made this beautiful cake, and if you want to see how to make it, I've put the link in the video description below. To make my cake, first we're going to build the cake.
3, 2, 1, go!
Secure your first layer of cake to a cake board using a dollop of buttercream frosting, and then spread your cake with more buttercream. I'm using 6 layers to build an extra tall 6-inch cake. This will serve around 20 people. I'm using my perfect chocolate cake and my 4-minute buttercream frosting, and I've put the links for those tutorials in the description box below. Try to put each layer of cake directly over the layer below, so the cake will have straight, even sides.
Isn't that an astute observation?
After baking these cake layers, I let them cool and then used a serrated knife to level off the tops and then cut each cake in half horizontally to make 2 layers out of each cake. Give your cake a crumb coat, which is a thin layer of frosting all over the cake to trap in the crumbs. I've chilled these layers before building my cake because when they're cold, they're less crumbly. I use an offset spatula to apply the frosting, wiggling it back and forth to spread the frosting and always lifting it off the cake at an angle so it doesn't pull any cake and frosting with it. I use a bench scraper to smooth the frosting, going around and around and around to scrape the frosting evenly around the cake. Add more frosting to places where the frosting is thinner or there's an air pocket, and then smooth it out again. This coat of frosting doesn't have to be perfect, it's just a base coat, but it needs to completely cover the cake so none of the crumbs can sneak into the final coat of frosting. Chill the cake for about 30 minutes in the fridge to set the crumb coat, and now it's time to apply the final coat of frosting. Again, I'm applying the frosting with an offset spatula and smoothing it with a bench scraper. Now put the cake back in the fridge to chill it completely before the next step. We're going to use buttercream frosting to sponge paint the skyline onto the cake. Take a bit of frosting and add gel food colour to make it the colour you want. I'm making 3 shades of purple and blue for 3 rows of the skyline, with the darkest colour at the front and the lightest at the back. Then add water a tablespoon at a time, stirring to mix it all together to thin out your buttercream. This is the consistency you're looking for. It will be easily spreadable, or in this case, spongeable.
It is different and therefore we should fear it.
To check the consistency, dip a sponge into it, and if the frosting sticks easily to the sponge and leaves soft peaks behind in the bowl, it's ready. I've made some pale purple buttercream mixed with water and divided it into 2 bowls. I'm adding some of this blue to one of the bowls to make it an in-between shade of bluey purple. Now we're going to make stencils for the skyline. You can buy city skyline stencils, but they're expensive.
I'll just need a credit card number. You owe $27,001.
Instead, we're going to make the stencils ourselves. Using lined paper, sketch out a city skyline. It's easier if the lines on the paper go vertically. You'll see why in a minute. In the movie, the internet is shown as a city and the colours are turquoise and pink and purple, so we're going to create a representation of that. Tape your drawing onto a piece of acetate with the drawing facing the acetate. Now cut the skyline out, cutting through both the acetate and the sketch you made. Don't worry if you end up improvising and cutting outside of the lines you drew, making your buildings taller or narrower or whatever. Just use the vertical lines on the notebook paper as a guide to make sure your buildings are straight. This is why it's useful to use lined paper instead of plain paper, and to have the lines going vertically instead of horizontally. When you've cut along the skyline, pull the tape off and throw away the sketch and you'll have 2 skyline stencils. Now sketch another skyline, but with smaller buildings. This will go at the top of the cake to be the buildings in the distance, and the large buildings from the first stencil will be at the foreground, at the bottom of the cake. Follow the same steps to cut out this skyline and you'll have 2 more stencils. Now you'll need some pins and your stencils, and your chilled cake. This is how the skyline is going to look.
Whoa, cool!
And now I'll show you the technique. Take your stencil, starting with one of the small buildings, and pin it to the cake. You don't need lots of pins, just 1 at each end and 1 in the middle will probably be enough, depending on the size of your stencils. Make sure the stencil is wrapped tightly around the cake before you pin it. You can either do 1 stencil at a time, which I'm doing here, or you can trim your stencils so they fit exactly around the cake without overlapping each other. Now dip your sponge in your watered down buttercream and start painting. You want to swipe down, away from the stencil, which means you won't be pushing any buttercream up underneath the stencil.
What is it you're trying to say?
Up underneath the stencil. It will look streaky at first, but keep going. As you pull the sponge down more and more times, it will spread the buttercream and smooth out the streaks. Having a really cold cake is key here, because it lets you smooth out the watered buttercream paint without indenting or smudging the original coating of frosting on your cake. When you've finished, put your cake back in the fridge or the freezer to chill your painting. If you move the stencil or pin on another one straight away before chilling it, you might damage the first part of the painting. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please click the thumbs up button.
Heart, 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 yes, heart.
Now pin on the next stencil. Because the cake is cold, you won't smudge the first part of the painting. Use your sponge to paint the rest of the way around the cake, and then chill your cake before removing the stencil.
Holy cow!
This is the most beautiful miracle I've ever seen.
You can do any touch-ups with a paintbrush dipped in some of the watered-down buttercream. I like that you can see some blue at the bottom of the back row of buildings because I think it adds depth, making the pink buildings look much further away than the purple buildings. After chilling the cake, I'm going to make a final row of buildings. I'm using the stencil I made with bigger buildings so that they look closer than the buildings in the background.
Attention to detail is pretty impressive.
Pin on the stencil and then start at the bottom of the cake, sponging upwards to cover the base of the cake. Don't sponge all the way up to the stencil because you might push frosting underneath the stencil. After painting this ring around the base of the cake, I'm painting downwards all around the cake from the top of the buildings on my stencil. I'm painting up and down to cover up all of the pale blue frosting with the colour of my buildings. I'm using my darkest colour, so the buildings look closer than the paler coloured buildings in the distance.
You're not wrong.
Tidy up the board, chill, take off the stencil, and voila!
I'm freaking out hard.
Now we're going to make the figures for a 2D fondant transfer. I looked for an image of the movie poster on Google Images.
Guess we know where to go if we ever need a pair of goggles. There's a whole building full of them.
Print out 2 copies, with the part with the characters the same size as the height of your cake. Leave one copy intact as a reference and dissect the other one, cutting out each main colour of the characters. This looks like it's going to be difficult to recreate, but it's really not. You'll need fondant of each of the colours in the picture, and a knife or X-Acto blade, and a paintbrush with some water, and a rolling pin. A silicone mat is helpful. Starting with this flesh colour, which I made with white fondant with a bit of yellow and pink mixed in, I'm rolling it out as thin as I can and then placing the body parts on top, cutting around them with my knife. Then I'm using the side of my knife blade to touch up the fondant shape, smoothing out any rough edges or corners. It's a good idea to do the faces in the first batch so they can harden up a bit before adding more details. Wherever there are shadows in the picture, like along Ralph and Vanellope's jawlines to distinguish between their chins and their necks, I'm indenting the fondant instead. I'm continuing with Ralph's shirt, which I'm simplifying to plain red instead of the plaid pattern. I've divided the shirt into 2 parts, which are on either side of the strap of his dungarees or overalls, or whatever you call them.
My mommy a cake, she turned into a big bear. My Alden tried to dare it. We can't understand her.
Now I'm doing the dungarees and attaching the shirt with my paintbrush, which I've dipped in a bit of water. He's wearing a green undershirt, so I'm adding that onto the back of his outfit, so it sticks out above his red shirt. I'm using the same green I'm going to be using for Vanellope's hoodie. A little black disc for the button on his overalls, and 3 little yellow discs for the buttons on his shirt. While I have the green out, I'm cutting out Vanellope's hoodie, indenting it to show where the arms and the hood are. I have a slightly lighter shade of brown for Ralph's hair. I'm cutting out a basic outline and then cutting some zigzags into the edge for his spiky hair. Since Ralph's face has started to harden, it's easy to attach the hair now while it's soft, so I can wrap it around the face and put his sideburn where it's supposed to go, using a tiny bit of water to attach it. I'm making his eyebrows now too, using the same light brown and rolling it into little logs, angling them upwards on his face to match the expression on the printout. Here's his nose, which I'm doing with a skin-coloured ball, and now I'm moving on to Vanellope's black hair.
Do you have magic hair? No.
Following the printed cutout with the ponytail and wispy strands of hair that hang in front of her face. I'm attaching this onto her face, using my picture as a reference for how to position it, and adding the black part of the inside of her mouth at the same time, attaching her hoodie and her hands, and adding the red detail of her bow, the confetti in her hair, and the strings on her hoodie. Now I'm attaching Ralph's arms, and then his head and feet, making a little ball for Vanellope's nose, and making her eyes with the whites, greeny yellow, and the black pupils, and very thin strands of black fondant for her eyeliner. I made her mouth but didn't like it, so I'm going to skip this bit and show you how I redid the mouth later instead. Now I'm doing Ralph's eyes, the whites, pale brown, and black centres. His mouth is just gritted teeth, so I'm cutting out a white triangle and indenting the teeth with my knife. The arrow is straightforward. It's easy because it's angular, and then I'm just cutting out two parts where Ralph and Vanellope's hands are going to go. I'm piecing the parts together to check that the shapes fit, but I'm going to place each of these three parts separately onto the cake, because if I try and move it all at once, I'm nervous it will fall apart. I've just realised that Vanellope's eyes are too close together, so I'm moving them apart with the side of my knife blade. I'm sliding a huge spatula or cake lifter underneath it to check that it isn't stuck to the mat. And now we're going to transfer this fondant image from the mat onto the cake.
Put on your church shoes, little sister, because we're about to blast off!
That makes sense.
Vanellope's face, the arrow, Ralph's arm, and his body and head.
Everything goes back to the way it was!
Now I'm going to redo Vanellope's mouth because the lips are too fat and too pink.
What is up with that?
I'm taking my first attempt off with my knife, reshaping the black inside of her mouth, cutting a thin white strip for her teeth and indenting gently to mark out the teeth, and then adding a tiny bit of pink to the flesh-coloured fondant and rolling it really thin to make the lips, wrapping them around the black mouth shape and pinching them at the sides to make a smile. The facial features of characters are the most difficult part, because it's what makes them so distinctive. I'm attaching this mouth to Vanellope's face, and I'm much happier with that. So there it is! A cake covered with a buttercream skyline and 2D fondant transfers of the main characters. Remember to watch the fondant cake tutorial over on Delicious Sparkly Cakes. Subscribe to my channel for new cake decorating tutorials every week. Thanks for watching!